Before we begin, listener discretion is advised, as I will be mentioning murder, the occult, adultery, and bloody injury. This is a case which I grew up near. I never looked into the details before researching this week. And also I was fairly young when it happened. So get comfy, grab a drink, sit back and listen to this week's offering. For this week's case, I have used YouTube and newspaper articles. I do know that using articles is a bit dodgy and it depends on reporter bias. So I have cross-referenced and used quotes that are legitimate that I've found elsewhere. This is the case of Keith Slater, a murder that took nearly 19 years to bring the murderer to justice. Let's go back to 1988. On August 26th, Keith Slater went to Little Switzerland with his wife Carol and his 2 children. Little Switzerland is a wooded area with paths, parks and ponds. It's beautiful. It used to be an old quarry, and it's in a small town called Hezzo, which is in East Yorkshire in England. Who was Keith Slater? Keith Slater was a driving instructor who worked for a franchise. And on the morning of the 26th, after the trip to Little Switz, he popped into the driving school in the afternoon, and this was after he picked up his car from the garage. But one thing about Hezzo is that people do like our sports here, very much like our rugby. And Keith was no exception to this. He was a keen rugby player. He was so proud, it's said that he would wear his team's tie and jumper whilst he was at work. At some point during the day, Keith and Carol's children had gone to their grandmother's to stay the night. This was one fortunate event out of everything that would happen. This was one of those small mercies in hindsight. Going on into the evening, Keith picked Carol up from her work, and she worked at the local home base. Keith picked her up around 8:30 p.m. They did a little bit of shopping after, and just before 9 p.m. they arrived home to their address on Bonaccord Road in Hezzo. The evening was quiet. At 10:30 p.m, Carol wasn't interested in the programme that they'd both been watching, and she went to bed. Around an hour later, Keith then went to bed. So just a standard day and a standard evening. And nothing really noteworthy, just a typical evening in the 80s. Well, even a typical evening, now. We now go to a different part of Hessel, some information, and the time is just before midnight. A barman was walking home when he encountered a man on Northgate, asking directions to Bonaccord Road. The mystery man then went close to Hessel Square. Now, Hessel Square is a central hub, and it's got shops, bars, you can literally walk into the small town centre and get whatever you want. So it's possible there was plenty of people about at this time as the pubs was kicking out. Back in the 80s, there was a taxi firm called Andy Carr's Taxis. The mystery man went in and asked again for directions to Bonaccord, but I'm guessing he didn't get those from the barman that he saw. The operator at Andy Carr's gave the mystery man the directions on how to get to Bonaccord Road. I'm sure, looking back on it now, that operator probably wishes he hadn't. But back then, you didn't suspect something bad. He was just helping, a fellow human being out. Now we go back to Bonaccord Road and the Slaters' home. And it's just after midnight, so we're now on the 27th of August. There's a few loud knocks at the door, and Keith gets up to answer it. The mystery man asks, "Keith Slater?" Keith responds, "Yes." This sealed his fate. Carol says, and quote, "I then heard what I knew was the sound of persons struggling. No words were spoken as I ran down. I saw that Keith was covered in blood over his left shoulder. I knew he had been stabbed." End quote. Keith had indeed been stabbed, and Carol witnessed the mystery man standing over her husband before he fled the scene. Carol's screams were heard by a couple a block away whilst they were walking home. They thought it was a party that was happening. They did see the mystery man around 12:25, and this man came out of Bonaccord Road and headed towards a footbridge. Their description matched the barman's description, the operator at the taxi office's description, and Carol's. This man was described as stocky, with a crew cut, an age estimated as in his 20s or early 30s. Carol was also able to help make an artist's impression. When police arrived, Carol was cradling her deceased husband in her arms in the living room. It was said the murder scene was covered in blood, that Carol was covered in blood, and the mystery man would have been covered in blood as well. Keith Slater had been stabbed in his neck. Because police had numerous witnesses, they were able to follow the route that the mystery man took, and some evidence was gathered. A matchbox was found and a blooded tissue. Unfortunately, in the 1980s, they were unable to get the DNA from the blooded tissue, although they did know the blood on the tissue was from Keith Slater. This evidence would be put away. 6 weeks later, after the brutal murder, Humberside police went on a TV programme called Crimewatch. It's a programme in the UK used to air at prime time and basically ask for the public's help in assisting with crime. You can view the episodes on YouTube. They are there. The police had no solid leads and no motive. They appeared to be clutching at straws, and all theories were being looked at, and this is the one reason they went on Crimewatch to ask for the public's help. They even looked at the possibility of Keith having an affair. Police did appeal for 2 women to come forward to try and gather more information. These women were never treated as suspects. One theory was that Keith was having an affair and one of the women's boyfriends or husbands may have killed Keith due to this. The police really didn't have anything. Due to all of this, police didn't even know if this was a one-off killing or whether the killer would strike again. From what I have said so far, it's easy to speculate that the mystery man didn't know the area. The police even mentioned that the route he left the scene was odd. I have grown up around the area, and it is true. There's more direct routes than the route he took to get out of the area, to go to, populated places. There just wouldn't be much for the mystery man to access over the bridge. So Crimewatch was playing out on the TV, and it worked. 200 miles away in Surrey, something clicked for the mum of the landlord called Barry Williams. Soon as Barry was told about Crimewatch and he heard the name Slater, he went across to his local police station and said he's got some information for them. So we're going a little bit back in time. We're going to July of 1988. And Barry rented some rooms to 2 brothers, Patrick and Martin Brown. Barry described them, and this is a quote, "They really liked chalk and cheese. Patrick was very outgoing, vivacious, lively. Martin was a quieter, calmer person altogether." End quote. Barry also described a friend the brothers had called Joe Henry. The 3 men were said to frequently disappear off into the woods. So Barry, the landlord, had mentioned that he'd heard different things about this friend, Joe Henry. And again, here's another quote from Barry. "Joe Henry was a forceful character. I was told he was a gypsy and that he had some high ranking in gypsy circles." End quote. He does go on to give some more details about what he heard, including it's also thought that Joe Henry knew all about shamanism. We're now beginning to see different parts of this evolving. But still, how does this all relate to Keith Slater? The reason Barry went to the police was due to the fact that these 3 men would often bring up the name Slater. Slater in the household was seen as this great evil spirit. When things go wrong in the house, you tend to blame it on someone other than yourself. When anything went wrong in Barry's household, it was blamed on Slater. Barry goes on to say that one night, Patrick Brown turned around to him and quite matter-of-factly and coldly just said, "Slater is dead." Barry, thinking these guys kind of live in this fun fantasy world. I mean, they pop off into woods, gypsy circles, shamanism, and the fact Slater was this spirit responsible for things going wrong in the house. This is what Barry thought, and again, this is a quote: "I never for 1 minute attached the name to a human being," end quote. And to be honest, I probably wouldn't have done that as well. These men, when they spoke about Slater, from what I've read and heard, they dehumanized it. It was literally, he was this spirit. Finally, this was the link the police needed, and it may seem quite a stretch, but they also discovered more details. They just needed this link to start the investigation to look. Police began to investigate and soon realised there was a connection between Keith Slater and Joe Henry. Turns out Keith's wife Carol, at one point in time, had worked alongside Joe Henry in an old people's home. They also had a brief affair whilst they was working together, and Keith found out. Keith did what I think any husband would do in the situation, and he warned Joe Henry off his wife. This was what the police needed. There was a link here and a potential motive. Could they have got their man? Was that mystery man Joe Henry? Police got hold of the Brown brothers, Martin and Patrick, and also Joe Henry. They were actually arrested and then questioned regarding Keith's murder. During this, police found out that Joe Henry and Patrick Brown had cast iron alibis and could not have possibly committed the murder. Martin Brown didn't have a solid alibi. It's said that Martin had gone to London to buy some drugs for his brother. He then decided to partake in alcohol and got drunk. He then fell asleep on a random park bench in a random park whose name he couldn't pronounce. He also had absolutely no witnesses to any of this. This does sound extremely sketchy. Police have a dilemma on their hands. Joe Henry, seeing the obvious suspect, there were the links there to the Slaters. Martin Brown didn't seem to have any links, so what would the motive be? I'm pretty sure police, if you probably are thinking now, may have thought that Joe Henry put Martin Brown up to it. They all ran in the same circles, but I couldn't find any mention of this. But that's just speculation I had. Then things get a little bit weirder. Martin Brown apparently confessed to killing Keith Slater to his mother. And that's to Martin Brown's mother, not Keith Slater's. Martin Brown's mum, I'm guessing, Obviously concerned by this and being a religious person, she went to a priest for comfort and sought advice on what to do. I'm guessing the police were quite happy by this because Martin's mother didn't end up keeping it to herself. She did let them know. There was confidence in the police force that this confession would help them convict Martin Brown of murder. As with everything in life, it doesn't go smoothly, and for legal reasons, this confession couldn't be used in court. It wouldn't hold up. After 7 years, all possible leads of inquiry had been exhausted, and although the case was never closed, it was scaled down. So police had the prime suspect. He'd confessed, but they just didn't have enough to nail him and bring him to justice. It would be 15 more years before they got another break. Sergeant Phil Bell joined the original detectives, Chief Superintendent Colin Andrews. He brought a fresh pair of eyes to look through the evidence. Over 2,000 statements that were part of the original inquiry were reassessed. This is when Sergeant Phil Bell spotted a remarkable clue. And here's the quote: "I'll never forget the document number. That's document number 141. And as I opened it, I thought it was a photocopy of a matchbox that's been found a mile away from the scene. There were 2 rows and numbers written on the back of the matchbox, and I remember calling the IT girl in the office. I asked, well, what's Martin Brown's date of birth? And she said 18th of February 1964, end quote. The side of the matchbox did indeed have Martin Brown's date of birth on it. It also had the date of the murder. When the detectives looked at the side of the photocopy, he also found that it had 32, which was Slater's house number. This may have been the piece of evidence to tie everything together. Sergeant Phil Bell thought this was so significant and he needed to take it to somebody. He couldn't believe it hadn't been brought to anyone's attention before. And this just proves how looking at even the same evidence with fresh eyes can really help. Dr. Richard Hoskins, who's an expert in numerology, was approached, and he said, quote, "For a person who's into numerology, it will dictate everything they do. And the most fundamental dates in numerology is the birth date of a person. That's produced and worked out into a single number," end quote. So adding all Martin Brown's digits, as it were, together for his date of birth would produce the number 4. It said the number 4 indicates a person of great determination. They literally go and do what they want in life. Some people say numerology is an occult practice. That's up to you guys to decide. You know, I'm sure you have your own feelings on that. A general feeling was that they felt Martin Brown thought he was protected and empowered by actually writing this number down. Now for a little complication regarding this, because it wouldn't be this story without finally getting a run and then being halted. The Chief Superintendent, Colin Andrews, has said, quote, "This case never closed and Martin Brown was always a suspect. We just had to wait for the technology to catch up. It was a wicked crime," end quote. Martin Brown, during the previous years, had actually moved to Australia and was living quite comfortably there. Martin had a job and had raised his own small family, something Keith Slater never got to do. Remember the blood-stained tissue that was looked at? Well, they looked at it again. Scientific advances had been made, and it was due to that they may be able to get a copy of the killer's DNA, as they already had Keith Slater's DNA on the tissue. Given the time had passed, the tissue was in very poor condition. It had been stored for many years and was frail. There was a possibility that the tissue would yield no DNA evidence at all. This didn't stop the forensic team, though, from looking at it. The team carried out numerous DNA tests and several, in fact all of them initially, came back negative. After 2 years, the forensic team had found nothing, but there was a new scientific breakthrough, and this offered a tiny glimmer of hope in getting the murderer's DNA. The team used a technique called low copying for the DNA, and this is so sensitive. It is sensitive enough to pick up tiny fragments of DNA. After a third attempt, they was able to get a full DNA profile that wasn't from Keith. So they had the DNA of the murderer. We're in the early 2000s now, and the profile that they got was entered into the National DNA Database. Unfortunately, there was no match found. It's now the police's job to try and find the missing link and link this DNA to the murderer and Keith Slater. Phil Bell felt that it was extremely important and a priority to obtain a sample of Martin Brown's DNA, as he was still the main and prime suspect in this murder. As mentioned earlier, Martin had moved to Australia, so getting a DNA sample wasn't going to be easy. Detective Phil Bell took the decision to try and get a sample of paternal or maternal DNA, which would link the DNA to the Brown family. Norman Brown, Martin and Patrick's dad, did agree and provide the DNA sample. The DNA sample did come back as positive for one of Norman's sons. 3 out of 4 of Norman's sons were quickly eliminated as the owner of the DNA, and it only left one son, Martin Brown. This was the link the police needed to finally be able to catch Keith Slater's murderer. So Phil Bell got Martin Brown's number and gave him a call in Australia. Now, if I've managed to do this correctly, we should be able to hear that phone call, and it was actually taken from the Crimewatch Redux program. So fingers crossed this works.
Hello.
Hello there, is that Martin?
It is.
Martin, it's DS Phil Bell from Humberside. We're reinvestigating the Keith Slater murder. The reason we're reinvestigating the murder is that we have obtained a DNA profile, which we are trying to find the source. And I've got to ask you whether you consent to provide a DNA sample.
I understand your concern with Keith Slater murder, but
Yeah.
what did I be concerned?
Well, you could do that.
I'll think about it. That's all I could say at this stage.
And what about coming across to this country to be interviewed about it?
I don't think so, mister.
Okay. If we came across to Australia, would you be amenable to be interviewed across there?
I think I'll help you as best I can, like.
Right, okay. I take it that's a no then, is it?
Well, not just to suit you bastards, no.
So that was the phone call. We're now going to fast forward a little bit to 2006. This is nearly 18 years since the murder. Martin Brown was arrested in Australia and he went to jail there, ready to be extradited to the UK to stand trial for the death of Keith Slater. Martin Brown was convicted and sentenced at Sheffield Crown Court at the beginning of 2007. Martin Brown received a life sentence. Throughout the trial, he did maintain his innocence, but there was also some conflicting information. There is a paragraph from an article I could use to demonstrate this, but it refers to Keith as Kevin Slater, so I'm not going to add it. All of the details are correct, but I can't confirm the validity of the information. But if you Google, you'll be able to see all of this for yourself. In 2012, nearly 24 years later, Martin Brown did finally confess to murdering Keith Slater. I still have a lot of unanswered questions, and so did the police. The police believed that the other brother, Patrick, and the friend Joe Henry was also involved somehow, but there was just never enough evidence to convict them. Martin Brown had said at one point that he was given the weapon and told where to go by another assailant. This has all been put to bed now, and it has been many years since the conviction and the murder. It does show how the police knew they had the evidence, but they just were waiting for the advances in science to be able to prove it. It also showed resilience of the police force for not giving up, for continuing to push forward and finally catching the killer. The judge in the case did say that we may never know why Martin Brown killed Keith Slater, as a reason has never been given. We can speculate that someone else was indeed pulling the strings and helping plan, and it makes sense that Joe Henry may have been involved, but this is all speculatory and there's been no evidence found. A disturbing fact I did find is that before the night of the 26th, morning of the 27th of August 1988, Martin Brown had never met Keith Slater and didn't even know what he looked like. If it had got the wrong house and somebody agreed to be in Keith Slater, it could have been another man that was murdered that night. Mr. Slater's family have said in a statement, quote, "Keith was a wonderful husband, father, brother and friend who will always be remembered and missed by everyone that knew him. We are glad that justice has been served at last and hope we can now move forward with our lives." End quote. And that's it for this week's podcast. How much do you think numerology played into this? I know it was mentioned, but nothing I could find really went into depth to give a reason for numerology being the cause of the murder. As always, if you have managed to make it this far to the end, thank you so much for listening. It's extremely appreciated. Don't forget to check out our other social medias. Drop us a like if you've enjoyed this. If you've got any suggestions for any future episodes, please also drop us a message. Good night.